Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Caregiver's Toolbox, tools for everyday caregiving. I'm your host, Ryan McAniff, and on this podcast, we give you information and education about senior care topics. And my guest today is Erin Galyean, who is the author of The Badass Advocate, Becoming the Champion for Seriously Ill Loved One, Becoming the Champion for, I'm missing that, what's that word? For the serious ill loved one deserves. That the serious ill loved one deserves. I purposely make mistakes in the beginning of this, so Erin does not feel the pressure of having to be perfect. So, Erin, thank you so much for being on the show. It is greatly appreciated.
Third time's a charm, right?
Yeah,
I really appreciate you sacrificing yourself for me. So that's so nice of you.
That is the sword I am more than happy to fall on for my guests, to be the fool, and then everybody else feels like, all right, Ryan's made a fool of himself. We can only go up from here. So anyways, thank you so much. We had to reschedule this multiple times because we both got sick in different parts of the country, but I guess there's the same flu, COVID, whatever going around that infected our households, and we both went down on separate times. So I'm glad we're feeling better, and we can talk about your book. That's you've obviously spent a lot of time and investment writing in. A lot of real world experiences went into that. So Erin, thank you so much. Let everybody know who you are and kind of the background that caused you to say, hey, you know what, I'm going to sit down and take the time to write a book and put my thoughts out and try to help people that are out there.
Sure. So thank you so much for having me on here and letting me share my story. My story really starts about 22 years ago. In 1997, my father, Mike, was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. He was just 53 years old, and took my family by surprise. My dad was really the soul of our family. He was a lot of fun, and he just made the household lighthearted, and he was, a party all the time. Made lots of cheesy jokes that embarrassed us as teenagers. But besides that, Dad was the best. So when he got diagnosed, of course, we were all shaken up and upset. And unfortunately, 10 months later, my dad would pass away at the age of 53. From there, of course, we went through the grieving process, and we all became adults and had our own children and marriages. And in 2017, my sister Megan, so just fast forward 20 years after my dad passed away, she was diagnosed also with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Now, we've been told there was no connection there. It's just coincidental. They did have different strands of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And when she went to the hospital because she was having trouble breathing, she had the cancer diagnosis, but the doctors were kind of perplexed. They knew that trouble breathing was not typically a symptom of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So they kept her overnight. They continued to do some tests. And what they found was that Megan, yes, had cancer, but she also had an autoimmune disease that caused a lung disease. And this disease that she contracted was very rare and aggressive, which is the last thing you want when you are diagnosed with a disease, because it means it's going to intensify quickly and the doctors don't know how to treat it. Immediately after, my sister started her chemo treatments, and she went through that for 5 months. In March or February of 2018, my sister was cancer-free, so we were happy to celebrate that. It was the good kind of cancer, if you can say that. And so that gave us a lot of hope. But unfortunately, over the winter, when she was going through the chemotherapy treatments, the pulmonologist could not treat her lung disease just because of the medication she was on to treat the cancer. This was pretty much worst case scenario, because this lung disease is aggressive. That means it just gave it opportunity to worsen. And by that February, March timeframe, yes, she was cancer-free, but she also was in worse shape health-wise. She went from this athletic, active mom of 2 young girls to a very frail patient who could barely walk around her house without needing an oxygen machine. This was really shocking to my family. My sister was a former collegiate athlete, and this was so not the Megan that we knew, and it was hard to watch. During this time, I lived in Dallas, Texas. My sister lived in Charleston, South Carolina. And as background, I have been in the pharmaceutical industry for over 20 years. So I realized that when I would go and visit her, and even when I was home, the knowledge that I gained from my professional experience was a real asset to me. It helped me to powerfully advocate for my sister because I teach pharmaceutical reps how to speak to physicians every day. That's what I train them on, how to not only have conversations and get through that uncomfortableness sometimes that salespeople come up against, but also how to ask good questions, maybe how to deal with difficult personalities, things that also patient advocates deal with. And of course, that wasn't my career goal, but it happened to come in handy. And I was so glad that I had that knowledge and experience so I could support my sister, who was also my best friend. Unfortunately, my sister would pass away 13 months after her diagnosis. She was just 47 years old. She died 3 days before her 48th birthday. And she left behind a husband and 2 young girls. So it was heartbreaking. I'm still heartbroken about it and grieving. I don't know if I will ever stop grieving my sister because we were so close. But I knew when she passed away that I had to continue to honor her and keep her spirit alive. And I know that she left a legacy by influencing young girls and women by coaching them in the sport of lacrosse and how she gave back to her community constantly. And I wanted to do the same, but in my own way. And my way of doing that was to share strategies that I used and my family used to advocate for Megan during her illness. And that's why I wrote Badass Advocate. And I'll say it again, becoming the champion your seriously ill loved one deserves.
And so obviously that's a horrible story to have 2 loved ones pass away from essentially the same. I guess maybe it doesn't matter if it's the same diagnosis, but it certainly makes you wonder what was going on. But trying to take that and turn it into a positive and utilize it. I think a lot of people in the healthcare field get into it because of a personal experience. Now, maybe you're not quote unquote in the healthcare field because you're pharmacology and pharmaceuticals, but at the same time, that's the catalyst that caused you to decide to start helping others by writing a book and trying to give back to those people that are going through the very thing that you and your family went through. So I think that's an outstanding way to try to not only grieve and work through it, but also to be able to, like you said, take the memory of your loved ones and be able to try to put it to good use for people that are inevitably going to find themselves, unfortunately, in the same position that you found yourself in.
I think it's really common for people to just be thrown into this situation. Many of us have never been here before. And at some point, you're going to be your first time, right? So you don't have experience. You don't go to school for it. You don't have necessarily my background, or you're not necessarily a medical professional who is knowledgeable about medicine and the jargon. And even if you are, it doesn't mean that your loved one's going to get the disease that you specialize in. So just to have these strategies that you can easily use, they're not difficult. Anyone can use them, but it basically will catapult you to where I was versus having to take years to figure this out. And now, caregivers that have been caregivers for 15, 20 years, and I know a bunch of them because maybe their loved one has Alzheimer's, or maybe they've been a caregiver multiple times and they've learned these things along the way. I don't want you to have to go through that. Why not start powerfully advocating for your loved one on day one versus waiting and to figure it out on your own?
And one of the things that I was looking at your website that made me laugh, and I'm sure you probably hear it from some of the home care companies, is you have a free downloadable resource that tells the difference between home health and home care. And it drives me nuts being a home care owner because it is such a ubiquitous term for so many different things that it can be understandably so very confusing. But it's such a perfect example of what you're talking about, of saying, hey, listen, there are some things that you would think would be blatantly obvious in this industry that you would differentiate in a better way of what certified VNA Medicare home care does versus private home care does. And you have obviously a very easy to read downloadable resource there, but it's just one of those examples of when you are trying to accept a horrible diagnosis or a crisis that has occurred, you are literally trying to drink from the fire hose of information while in some sort of state of shock of what the hell is just been told to me, especially about your sister, and it's certainly nobody wants to pass away, but as the adult child, you have, your dad passed away when you were young though, right?
I was 20, so I
20.
was technically an adult.
Yes. So, but when my mom died, I was 28. So it's still a young age because, I was
Yes.
driving a caregiver to a case today and she's like, my mom's still alive at 95 years old and she's like 65. So
Right.
obviously when you're in your 20s, that's still young, but you at some point in time in your life, you think about, hey, I'm going to have to care for my parents. My parents are going to get old. They're going to get sick. They're going to die. That's the circle of life. Certainly with a sibling, that's not something that comes to mind very often. But the point being is that when you're in those situations, dealing with it, trying to, understand what was just told to you, some of these basic things that I take for granted and knowing the difference between home health and home care are completely new to somebody. And the point I'm trying to make in my long-winded dialogue here is that that's just one small little sliver of the senior care world or the home care world. And that's not really even that huge of a deal. There are so many other things you need to know about. And that's where somebody like yourself in writing this book or the many other resources that are out there are designed to help people because, hey, listen, we're going to all inevitably be in this situation, whether it's ourselves personally or loved ones, family members, friends, neighbors. We're going to know people that go through this. And the more we're prepared and aware, the more we're going to have smoother sailing when you're going into turbulent times.
Yes, you're so right. There is a quote by Rosalind Carter, the former First Lady. I don't know if you've heard this quote before, but she says that there are four kinds of people in this world: those who have been caregivers, those who are currently caregivers, those who will be caregivers, and those who will need caregivers. So we all fall into one of those buckets, maybe all four at some point. I don't know, but we need these resources out there. We need to know where we can go to get help, because you're right. It's a fire hose of information. It's different for everyone because it depends upon the disease that you or your loved one has. The tips in my book are also for someone advocating for themselves. You need this information so you don't have to figure it out on your own. It's just too much. And
of course,
emotionally, you're overwhelmed. So then you
yeah.
got that on top of all the information that's being thrown at you.
And I was going to say, and if you go to WebMD and you have a headache and your ankle is sprained, well, then you probably have brain tumors and Ebola, and you probably have three weeks to live anyway. So it's not like going online is going to be a great resource, because when you're dealing with things like cancer or these chronic diseases that a lot of seniors have, everybody's unique. Every situation's different. Sitting down with a doctor with my mom and trying to get a straight answer out of this guy was impossible because there's no straight answer to give you. And those are the types of experiences that you don't really know about until you've sat through that roller coaster and done the loop-de-loops and the corkscrews, and basically you're flying blind and you don't know how long this roller coaster is going to last. So, I mean, what feels like 3 months ago when we initially spoke, we talked about, there's a couple areas of the book that were good. And one of the areas that you certainly wanted to talk about was talking about your support team and why that's so critical. And I would imagine most people can relate to that and get an idea about the support team. In my world of home care, generally the woman or the daughter is the they're the CEO of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Usually the brother's the treasurer or the financial person. And then everybody else in the company is kind of a per diem employee, kind of when I have time and can help out, but usually it falls on one person, I find. But certainly having a support team is huge. And how do you go about that? How do you build that when we see so often that it ends up being one person's shoulders where it all falls on?
Mm-hmm. So I think there's two scenarios, and I'm really going to generalize with different families here, but we can't go into every family situation. We don't have that much time. So you have families like what the picture that you just painted, the one where there are multiple children that can support their parents. Then you've got the other ones where maybe it's an only child, or maybe there's falling outs, but they are alone for whatever reason, right? They're just a single person. They don't have anyone that naturally would be a part of that caregiving team. So let's start with the first one. If you do have family members that can support and you're that main caregiver, you do kind of need to take control of this situation. And it may not be all of our personalities to be that CEO, as you put it, but it's in your best interest and the patient's best interest. So if you don't like to think it's in your best interest because you're that kind of person, you're selfless like that, then think about being an badass advocate for your mom or dad or whoever it is that's sick. That's what motivated me with my sister. I would do anything for her. So if I was uncomfortable with anything, I just thought, this is for Megan. And then I could pretty much do and say anything because I thought, I've got nothing to lose. I'm going to fight for her. So that may be a mindset you need to have when you're doing the same. If you have those family members, get together, you know them intimately, figure out who is best at what. It is like a company. I love that you use those terms, CEO, the CFO, you can also name each other fun things like that. If you want to make it lighthearted, if you're a goofy family, I do in the book, I called myself the VP of communications. And I really did that when my sister was sick. It was purely as a joke just to make my sister laugh about something stupid. And, we needed lighthearted moments. And it was because as the person who didn't live down the street, I was figuring out ways that I could support her from afar when I wasn't visiting. And one way I could do that was handle all the communications from my family and my sister's friends who wanted to know what was going on and how they could support, what gifts could they send, how they could support my sister's husband and girls. That is way too much for the patient and the caregiver to handle. And I basically took that off their shoulders, and my brother-in-law as well. And I had a conversation with them and I said, I will handle this because I'm not doing the day-to-day caregiving. And they were relieved. And we had that agreement. Now, that doesn't mean that no one could contact them and send love. And I made sure that everyone was clear. I informed family and friends, this is what I'm doing. I informed my family, they were good with it. And they could still get all those messages and gifts, and I could coordinate what was appropriate and what they would need. And it worked really nicely for my family. So that's just one example, but certainly delegate and figure out who is best for what. And we all have different personalities and we all have different strengths. Please tap into those strengths, okay? And don't be afraid to say, I need a break. If you are that main caregiver, and I agree with you, it is mostly women, but not all. Sometimes we feel guilt about leaving. No way should you feel guilty because you will get burnt out and then you will not be healthy enough to care for your loved one. So it is a necessity, not a gift, okay? It's a necessity. You have to do that. You have to ask people to come in and step in for you. So that's scenario number one.
And I was just going to say with that, just to that one point, is that usually that primary caregiver is going to be maxed out, but there is a big difference between being maxed out at 110% and then trying to be maxed out at 150%. And when you have family members that can help you out with that 40%, so that it's a huge amount of help. The world's coming down, but any little bit of help goes a long way, even if it's many hands make light work. So if everybody's able to do a little bit, even if that's all they can give, it adds up to a lot for that primary caregiver who's trying to be the CEO of this operation.
Absolutely. And if you are not that main caregiver and you're listening, figure out ways by observing. You can ask questions that you can step in and say, I'm going to do this. Because sometimes when you say, oh, let me know how I can help, they're never going to tell you. Okay. So figure out ways that you can help. Can you organize meals in the neighborhood? So, if let's say your mom is living with your sister, you can say, look, every Sunday, our friends and our family members in the area, they're going to deliver meals every Sunday. I've got it all coordinated. Oh my gosh, how nice is that? That's a lift off my shoulders. I don't have to worry about cooking mom and I a meal as well as my kids. Or maybe it's like, hey, every Tuesday and Thursday, I can pick your kids up from school because I know you're going to take mom to the doctor's office. Whatever it is, these are just little random examples, but there's so many ways you can help, and friends can too. So it's not just family. And obviously make sure it's okay with that person. Don't just start budging in. So that's one. That's if you have family, and I do feel like that's a little bit easier. And I have empathy for the people who don't have that natural support system that you were born into. So in that case, there's going to be a little bit more creativity involved. but you can still get support. And there is free support. Of course, there's paid support. So the free support would be getting creative with who is willing to help out. How about your friends? Like I just used that meal train example. A lot of times, like I know us women, when we have babies, we set up meal trains for each other after having a baby. You can do the same or ask a friend to do the same when you have a sick loved one. That is, my sister's friends did that. And I'll tell you, it was so nice. Now, sometimes they don't need meals. Sometimes it's too much. So you definitely want to communicate with the family or the patient and make sure you're on the right cadence. Is it too much? Do they have dietary restrictions? You want to check in on with all that. So you can have family member or friends. You also can have, think about, do you belong to a church? Do you belong to certain community outreach programs that can support you? If they have a certain disease, like let's say Alzheimer's, there are organizations that support patients and families like that. My family never tapped into this, and I feel like it's such a missed opportunity now that I'm getting involved with some of these organizations. They have amazing resources, and sometimes they have local people that would be happy to come over and help if you need it. So look into those type of things too, and again, start to get creative. The other thing that I was going to say is paid help. So we've talked about home care, home health. Look into your insurance company. What is covered, or the patient's insurance company? What's covered? What can you tap into where you can get someone to help in different ways? Okay, because it's too much for you. Palliative care, can they come? And remember, palliative care isn't end of life care. This is just someone with a long-term or serious illness. Doesn't have to be long-term, but a more serious illness like cancer, could be Alzheimer's. So tap into these different resources so you can get people to come and help. You just have to get creative. And my favorite thing is to mind map. In fact, I was doing one today for something else. If you don't know what a mind map is, Google it, you'll find examples. But basically, like, it's a brainstorming exercise. And if you're in situation number 2, you probably need to brainstorm on ways that people can help and who can help. And you may come up with way more ideas than you think.
And for people out there that may not realize that they're in this situation, when you were talking, I was like, well, I'm in that situation. So my dad lives down in Florida. My mom's already passed. What happens when my dad doesn't want to come up to Boston, back to Boston, where I grew up and where he raised me, because he wants to be in Florida? Well, we have a problem, right? But, and that brings me up to the point of, even if you have multiple people, multiple siblings, one maybe live in Chicago, one might live in LA, one might be living in San Francisco, and one might be, I don't know why, but Nebraska, let's say, or something, I don't know. And so then all of a sudden you have 3 or 4 family members that are all living, plane rides away, or maybe if you're lucky, somebody that's only a 3-hour drive one way away. And that is a lot to ask when you have family members and careers and a household that is that still needs to function on a day-to-day basis. So, for those sitting out, listening to Erin and the guidance she's giving, you might fall into that in a way that you don't necessarily know, because then all of a sudden that your mom or your dad is isolated on an island where they're not going to have the kind of support that family members that live within 20 or 30 miles of their parents can provide that support. And there are a wealth of resources out there, and a little proactive planning goes quite a long way, which I'm sure Erin would agree with. And that started that is buying her book. Of the questions you did send over to me, one thing I thought was kind of an interesting one was, I kind of want it because maybe I can get more referrals out of this or something, but from healthcare providers. But one technique that is a game changer when meeting with any healthcare professional. So I meet with them and I try to convince them to refer to Minute Women. Maybe it's not applicable to me, but any way that you can communicate with healthcare professionals is always good, because they are, right, especially now, they are overburdened with a lot going on. They are understaffed, and they are trying to, put 40 pounds of sand into a 20-pound bag right now. So every bit of communication with them is important. And how do you make that a game changer?
It is, yeah. So the game changer for my family was one that came out of necessity. So I mentioned I didn't live close to my sister, and my mom was her main caregiver. So they would go to the doctor. My mom is retired, and my sister was physically exhausted, plus she's on medication. If you have a sick loved one, you know how that can go. Sometimes their brain's a little fuzzy. Plus, as the patient, you're overwhelmed because of maybe the diagnosis and what's going on. They would go to the doctor, they would have this long conversation about her health and her next steps or whatever it was. And they would come home and I would call my mom and say, okay, how'd it go? And my mom would give me some highlights, but I would get very minimal information. And I would ask questions and my mom wouldn't necessarily know the answers to those. And I'm not blaming my mom at all. I've been that patient too, where you show up and then you ask these questions, you have this conversation, you go home and you forget 90% of what you talked about. So I started to think that this was a real issue because I know I couldn't support my sister not knowing what was going on, and neither could my brother-in-law or my brother, right? Because we didn't know what was happening in the doctor's offices. It really limited the way that we could help. So I suggested that they start recording their conversations with doctors. Now, this is something that I like to warn before I give this advice. Is number one, you need to have the patient's permission, because it is their private health information. So you have to make sure the patient's on board. Number two, you need to ask the physician because it is a private healthcare conversation. So they may say no. If that's the case, don't freak out. Doesn't make them a horrible person. Bring a notepad. Every caregiver should have a notepad. Every single one. Whether you're recording conversations or not, you need a dedicated notepad. It has all the information in it. So you can record anything important, and you're not having sticky notes all over the house that now some piece of important information is lost. Okay, so back to the recordings. So my sister went to her pulmonologist. She asked his permission. I remember the first time this happened. And a few days later, I must have been visiting because I remember sitting out on my sister's back porch and listening to the recording. And obviously I wasn't there at the time, or I would have gone to the doctor's appointment with her. And wow, was it mind-blowing that all of a sudden I had this wealth of information, and so did my brother, and so did my brother-in-law, and we could hear what was happening. And that helped us in a couple of ways. We could come up with more questions. The way that I think and my brother-in-law think, we all think differently. We also have very different professional backgrounds. How we approach things is going to be different. So as a team, and including my mom and my sister on that team, we all came up with different ideas, different questions, and different thoughts about next steps for her. So that made us really a badass team because we were working together. It wasn't just all on my mom's shoulders. The other thing is that, you also, and this wasn't intentional, but later on so we got in this habit of doing it. One point, my sister was in the hospital and she got in the habit of recording conversations. And guess what? We noticed one time that she seemed off. That wasn't the intention of the recording, but it was a bonus because we noticed this and then we brought it to the attention of the physician because she didn't seem like herself. They wouldn't have known that. They didn't know my sister intimately, but we knew that. And it happened to be that her CO2 levels were really high. So it helped us to catch something that it might have taken a few more days to catch. So there's other bonuses to it. Now that my sister's passed away, another bonus I didn't think about, I have all these recordings with her voice on it. And I just listened to one the other day because I miss hearing her voice. We don't have recorded tapes anymore, voicemails. We have voicemails on cell phones, but we have to delete those after a while, right? Or else we can't leave voicemails. So it's kind of a nice bonus that you have their voice too.
You're absolutely right.
That really was a game changer.
You're absolutely right. And again, it goes back to that fire hose of information of being able to kind of, you need to understand, and it's not you, Erin, it's whoever's listening. You are going to walk into this with the best of intentions of walking out, and you are going to hear very long words with lots of syllables in them and technical jargon that you are going to remember, if you are lucky, 10, maybe 15% of what happens in that conversation. It's a funny anecdote I had when the first big meeting with my mom, me and my dad with her cancer diagnosis. She's like, all right, Ryan, I am 6'5". I'm a big guy. I can be intimidating. And she's like, you need to sit in the corner. You need to shut up. And you need to let this doctor I'm like, yeah, Mom, not a problem. We're just going to listen to the doctor. He didn't get like 7 words out because I'm like, what does that mean? And what's this mean? And what do you mean about this? And I just remember my mom just giving me that like death stare of like, you couldn't make it a minute. You couldn't even do it in a minute. So, the point being is that if you were recording this, then you could, go back and digest it versus interrupting this poor doctor, 3 times every sentence because I'm like, well, what does that mean? Well, what do you mean that you can't do that? What is that can't work? And I'm
Here's
sure
another
he was
here's
thrilled with
another
me.
point now that you're saying that. And my mother-in-law just had a heart surgery. So we used this tactic just recently. And we do live close by, but all within like 45 minutes of each other. So it's not like right down the street. So the other plus was that if it was inconvenient for one of the siblings to be at the doctor's appointment or at the hospital with their mom for that, maybe they had a work meeting or whatever, but someone else was there. Well, they didn't all have to rush to get there. There didn't be all three siblings together. They could say, hey, make sure you record that so I can listen to it afterwards. So then we can talk about mom's next steps and what we need to do. So it's not like if everyone can't be present, there's not as much pressure. Just at least have someone there to support, and then you can rotate.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially nowadays with uploading to Dropbox or Google, and then just download it, and you can listen to it at your convenience wherever you want. And so, I thought, obviously we're kind of getting up against it, but the final one that I thought was interesting, that I really thought would be good for the listeners here, because I think most of our listeners are caregivers themselves. We do get a decent amount of listeners that are actually in senior care that get paid to be a caregiver, but at the same time, I think a lot of people who are in senior care are certainly fall into one of those 4 categories like you mentioned before, but I think a lot of them have been caregivers for loved ones in the past. But it's the self-care, with balancing self-care with patient care, because I think that we see time and time again, usually adult children who are women, but certainly can be men as well, that are just overwhelmed and overburdened, and again feel like the weight of the world's on their shoulders. And how do you balance your own health and well-being versus the one that you feel that it's your job to care for them because they cared for you for the first 20 years, 25 years of your life, and
Right.
now it's time to repay that favor.
Sure. So I think this is one of the most important topics that we can talk about, because it's what I see time and again on the social media platforms I'm on with caregivers, and they constantly talk about how they're burnout, and it's a real issue. And I do think there's fear of leaving the patient, or maybe they don't have the option, they feel like, because there's no one to step in, going back to our earlier conversation. So it's really important to figure this out for yourself, and it's going to look different for everyone. So what I came up with is a system that I use just in my professional life, and it easily carries over to caregiving. And I called it the 5 R's. So number 1, the first R is reflect. Wake up in the morning, 15, 30 minutes. I'm not a morning person. I try and be, but I'm not. So even if you can spare 15 minutes, that's better than nothing. But the morning is best. And I do say, like, if you can't do the morning, fine, do it later. But I'll tell you the morning's best because it's before your day becomes chaotic. Typically, if you let the day go, it's just not going to happen, no matter what your good intentions are. So number 1, this routine is reflect. Take a minute just to reflect on your feelings and your thoughts. You're going through a lot. And it doesn't mean it's the only thing you're going through either. You might have a whole family. You might have a newborn. Who knows what's going on in your life? But reflect on what you're going through and get those feelings out. Number 2, you want to review the calendar. And if you took any notes or the recordings, you want to review those for the patient. And so that way you can have a good plan going forward. And also you're planning out your day, right? You don't want to have like a 2:00 doctor's appointment and completely blank and forget because you didn't look at your calendar all day because you got caught up in taking care of your loved one. So make sure you review the calendar. That will take not long at all. If you have to review notes because you have that doctor's appointment that day, that gives you the opportunity to do that and plan ahead. You're not scrambling while you're waiting in the patient waiting room. Re-examine. Re-examine is number 3, and that is basically re-examining the patient's care. This may not be something you have to do every day, but at least touch on it just to think, do I need to re-examine anything? Is there anything that maybe is off? Is there anything that we haven't addressed? Are there questions that need to be answered that are big concerns? That's just setting aside that time to do that. Reevaluate. Reevaluate is reevaluating that support team. So if you're in that bucket number 1 I talked about, and you have that bigger family, that natural support team, maybe someone isn't stepping up to the plate and you need to have a hard conversation. Maybe someone's doing too much. And you need to tell them, you need a break. I'm going to step in for you and I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. Reevaluate what's going on, or maybe there's a gap that's not being filled. Think of it almost in a business sense. You're a team, or even if you like sports, a sports team. What are you missing? Who needs support? And then the last one is recharge. And this is before you start the day. And this is totally up to you. What helps you to recharge? Is it meditation? Is it prayer? Is it exercise? Whatever it is for you, take that time. Now that may extend that 15 minutes, right? Because it depends. If you go for a run, that may be, 30 or 40 minutes. I don't know. But also you could meditate for 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And if you're not into meditation, it might be something you want to check out. I wish I had really started meditating when my sister was sick, and I wish I had taught her how to do it, because I think it could have helped a lot just to handle our emotions a little bit more. So just take that time to do those things. I actually created a journal earlier this year called My Badass Advocate Journal, and there's 4 of them out there. One's a 90-day journal, and the other 3 are just 30-day journals, so they're a little bit shorter, and they take you through this routine. And I created it because I know how I am. Sometimes there's a great idea out there and I'm going to be like, that sounds great. And then I don't implement it. I need a little support. So the journal will support you if this is something that fits your life and you feel like you need this, which I think every caregiver does. That's out there. Of course, it's on Amazon, just like the book, and you can go and it will support you in your morning routine. The other thing I did want to mention that's on my website when you were first talking about self-care is that another important piece is when you have time to leave. And how do you make that happen? Even if it's for an hour or 30 minutes. One thing that we did when my sister was really sick is we had an aunt and uncle. They wanted to come visit my sister. So they flew down. We grew up in Philadelphia. They flew down there. Now they had not seen my sister this whole time. So they didn't know how to care for her. So what I did was I typed up a patient care sheet and I had all the information about my sister. I have a template on my website that gives you ideas and recommendations. This is so helpful to have stuff written down. Think about if you had young children and you are going to leave for the weekend. You don't just say, hey, good luck. No, you give advice. You say, the baby needs a bottle this time. And you put instructions, bedtime's here and they can't eat this because they're allergic to it. Same thing with the patient. What is good for them? Should you not talk about politics because it gets them upset? Or do they like to be read to? Do they like affection and hands held? Or because of COVID, should you keep your distance? I don't know. It's different for every family and every situation, but write all those things out. And then they can always refer back to it when they need it and you're out, even if it's for an hour or 24 hours.
Absolutely. And having and having an idea of what to do, even if you're just a short term, like you said, temporary caregiver, while the main family caregiver goes out to do shopping or needs, a couple hours to be able to take care of whatever they need to take care of. It doesn't matter. Having an idea of what's going on and how to be able to help and their likes and dislikes are certainly a really important thing. I know that with my mom, that it was pretty easy with my mom. She was like, I don't want anybody to come visit me unless you're in the immediate family, because I'm not going to have a living wake going on in this household while I'm on my deathbed. And I was like, well, this makes life easy. Just if the doorbell rings, I'll take your pie. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Close the door and then go from there. But absolutely, everybody's going to be different, and having that information is going to make everybody's life easier.
Yeah, and that's so important that you brought that up, is that you have to make sure everything's okay with the patient. Now, that being said, there are going to be patients that are going to say, I don't want anyone but you. And that is a conversation you're also going to have, because that's not fair to you. That's not possible. Now, you had still immediate family, so you had other support system, and that's fine. But you can't be the only person, because you will eventually burn out and get caregivers fatigue. So.
Yeah, I should clarify. I mean, it was close family and friends were allowed, but they had moved to a retirement community a few years earlier. So it wasn't like these lifelong bonds of neighbors they knew him well enough that they'd probably want to visit, but not well enough to be like, hey, listen, we knew each other for a couple of years. It's not too big of a deal. But everybody's going to be different on what they want. And we actually ended up getting 24-hour home care. So that was my first foray into having random strangers showing up and being the ones that are doing the caregiving. giving. So
Mhm.
it's a wild journey. But Erin, thank you for coming on. How do people reach you? How do people buy your items? Would you prefer them to go to your website or just go to Amazon, because Amazon's slowly taking over the world? What would you like to see people listening and want to get more of your information and your products?
Yeah, so it's really easy. So my website is badassadvocate.com. If you want to find me on social media, it's all Badass Advocate, except for TikTok, which I was new to, so I don't know what I was doing. I am on there and I share some videos, and that's just my name, Erin Galyean. If you want to buy the book, yes, you can go to my website if that's easier for you. There's a link on there. Or you can go, just as you said, to Amazon, and the journals and the book are on there. So it's easy. I'm also, my book is in barnesandnoble.com, and I think it's on walmart.com as well. So lots of options.
Look, you got the big three, probably target.com as well.
You know what? It was for a period of time. I don't know if it's still on there. I haven't checked it in a while.
All right. Well, it's Amazon made their bones selling books, so
That's
I'm
right.
sure most people are going to be going to Amazon anyways
It's
for it.
easy. It's there.
Hey, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm so glad we were able to do this, and with obviously your dad and your sister, I think that it's great that you're doing everything you can to turn such a difficult and negative experience into helping other people. And I think that is in and of itself part of the grieving process of trying to make sure that somebody's memory doesn't fade away or doesn't go away, and you're able to help pass along what you've learned through your difficult situation to other people. So I think that's commendable, and I think that's really great. And I'm happy there are lots of people out in the world like you that are trying to make a difference and help people out that way.
Thank you. I really appreciate those kind words, and thank you for having me.
All right. Well, even though you're from Philadelphia, we'll let that slide for now. Erin, thank you again so much. And thank you to all our listeners. Tom Brady doesn't even play for the Patriots anymore. I guess it doesn't matter. We're going to be in purgatory forever. We'll be done. But thank you all so much for listening. We appreciate your listening to my terrible intros and outros, and you really go for the meat here, which is Erin. She's the substance. I'm just bringing the good ones to you, and we look forward to catching you on the next one.